few hours ago, and it was Sunday night. The weeks do fly. We're glad to be together. And as far as our readings are concerned, we are in Matthew, and we are in Matthew 13 through 21, what we read between Sunday tonight. Matthew 13 is Matthew's record of Jesus teaching in what method? Parables, that's right. And used to teach folks, you just think chapter content, the parables of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like unto. And there seems to be a progression of the parables from the sower that went forth to sow, how people receive the word, and then obstacles that get in their way, the fact that it would start small and grow large. There would be people who would not appreciate it. There'd be people who understand the great value of it. And then altogether, though, even when people are in it, at the end of time, it's like a fisherman has a dragnet, and he brings in, there's good and bad, and he makes a separation there. 14 and 15 deal with some miracles. Used to tell people that you have the different opinions about the king. Herod, in chapter 14, the account of his having John beheaded, Herod thinks Jesus might be who? In verse 2. John the Baptist, risen from the dead. And then Jesus walks on the water, and the disciples think he's certainly the Son of God. And then the Pharisees in chapter 15 think he's just a violator of their what? Their traditions. And and he heals the Canaanitish woman's daughter. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000. 16, he announces that he's going to build what? This church on this rock. The great truth Peter confessed, that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. Based on that truth, he would build his church. And the gates of Hades, the unseen realm, would not prevail against it. Death, hell, and the grave would not prevent his coming forth from the grave and his establishing his church. In 21 following, he announces very clearly for the first time that he's going to have to do what? Die. And how, even? He'd go into Jerusalem, suffer many things of the chief priests and scribes, and we're seeing that right now in his trial, and be killed, and then the third day be raised up. And who objects? Peter. And the Lord called him who? Satan. Because you don't mind the things of God, but the things of man. And if he said, you know, Peter, you got a good idea. Why am I trying to do this? Then if he had followed Peter's advice, what would that have done to the whole scheme of redemption?
There wouldn't be any.
There wouldn't be any. Yeah, it would have thwarted the whole plan of God. And so sometimes doing the will of God is a little more difficult than doing the will of man, and yet the rewards are way, well, they're eternal. 17, what do we have? The transfiguration of the king. And they come down the mountain, and we have some other parables. In the end of 17, he comes toward Caesarea, and somebody asked Peter, does your master pay the half shekel? And oh yes, certainly he does. And then Jesus reminded him, who pays taxes? King's son or their servants, or who all, you know? And obviously the answer was, the king doesn't. Could Jesus have been exempt from paying taxes? Yes, because the temple actually was in honor of Jesus and God. But to keep anybody from stumbling, then he told Peter, you go to the sea and do what? Cast out a hook, and fish is going to come up, and there's going to be what? 1 shekel. And the temple tax was a half shekel. So he says, you take that and give for yourself and for me. All right, 18. You like to talk about the idea of offenses and offenders in the kingdom. There pictures on the way to Caesarea, there were people, the disciples were arguing over who was going to be greatest. And so now Jesus takes a little child and holds him up and says, except you turn and become as a little child, meek, inclusive, wants everybody to play with them, you'll not inherit the kingdom. In fact, he says in verse 3, I've used this passage a lot, and I know you have too. Except you turn or be converted and become as little children, ye shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. And so he talks about the fact that what they were doing in trying to exclude certain disciples who really were disciples, that was causing some to stumble. And then he points out in 7 through 14, don't do anything that would what? Cause anybody to sin. And then in 15 through 20, what happens if somebody does what to you? Exactly. Now, so here's the situation. Don't cause anybody to stumble. Really, the first 2 paragraphs. Well, what about if somebody sins against you? It causes you. Well, you go to them and that person. And then if he doesn't hear you, take 1 or 2. If he doesn't hear them, take it to the church. Doesn't hear the church, let him be unto you a what? A heathen, publican, and a sinner. Well, Peter has the idea, well, I can see this happening. In fact, I can see it happening 7 or more times. And so what should we do, Lord? If a brother sins against us 7 times, what does the Lord say? Forgive him 7 times. And then he gives this beautiful parable about a man who had some servants, owed 10,000 talents, verse 24, never could repay it. And so they begged for forgiveness, and the king forgave him. But that fellow servant, or that servant, had another fellow servant, who owed him 100 shillings, or about 100 days' work. And he made the same argument, the one who owed him. Give me time, please forgive me, and I'll pay you what you owe. So he took him by the throat and says, you pay what you owe. And what was the disposition of those other servants who heard all of that when he had been forgiven this massive debt that he could never repay? Exactly, reported him. And so what happened to the fellow who the unforgiving did?
Cast into outer darkness.
Yes. That's a great lesson. God has forgiven us of what we could never repay. And little minor nuances, not nuances, but nuisances that can come up between brethren. And somebody has the idea, well, I'll never do that. I'll never talk with him again. Never talk. No, you try to be bigger than that. And that's the point Jesus makes, looks like. Then in 19, he's across the river, 19 and 20, over in Perea. And what's the big question that the Pharisees ask him? Is it lawful to do what? To divorce. And he takes them back first to the law or first to creation? Creation. And then they have a follow-up question, well, what about Deuteronomy 24? And he says that was because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication, marries another, commits adultery. Whoever marries her that's put away commits adultery. The disciples thought, well, that everybody understands that, right? No, they said, this is a what? This is a hard saying. Who can hear it? And Jesus essentially said, yes, I understand what you're saying, and it is for everybody except, he said there were eunuchs that were born eunuchs who were made such by men, eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, people who won't marry is the idea. And he says, yet to everybody else it applies. So basically this teaching applies to everybody who marries. And those who wouldn't, obviously, the instructions would not apply. Then he comes down, let's see, we have the interview with the rich young ruler. And really, I try to emphasize, if you're just studying Matthew, 19:16, not the year, but the passage, chapter 19, verse 16, all the way down through 20, verse 16, should be taken as one large passage. And the reason is, the rich young ruler comes to Jesus. He goes away sorrowfully because he had what? Great possessions. And so then Jesus makes a comment on that in 23 and 24, that it's difficult for a rich person to enter heaven. And who then can be saved? And Jesus said, well, if you're going only on what men do, nobody, but with God all things are possible. Then Peter chimes up and says, he didn't leave anything. We left everything and came with you. What are we going to have? And that's when Jesus says, well, I'll tell you, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his kingdom, you also shall sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 thrones of it, the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, you're going to have a position of authority, the apostleship, if you please. And then even, anybody, not just you, anybody who has left father, mother, lands, houses, for my sake in the gospel, shall in this life receive the same, and in the world to come, what? Eternal life. And then he gives the point in chapter 20, in the 1 through 16, about the kingdom of heaven being like a householder who hired people. And see, that goes back to the question Peter said, we've left all. What are we going to have some greater reward? And he says, okay, it's like the householder hired people about sun up, and then 9, 12, 3, 5, and then he calls or makes a reckoning and was going to pay them, and he starts at the last, the one that came in at 5 o'clock, basically got off at 6, and gave him a denarii. And so then he worked backwards, and so they're thinking, well, the person who started at the break of dawn, break of day, he ought to get what? More. But he didn't. He got the same amount. And then the Lord pointed out, you cannot kind of divide eternity. That's just an impossibility. And so we study that in that light. Jesus heals a couple of blind fellas, and then in 21, we've come to the last week, and Jesus has his triumphal entry in Jerusalem and cast out the money changers, and then he's accosted by some, and they say, who gave you this authority to do these things? And he answers it by saying, the baptism of John. From whence did it come? From heaven or from men? And they knew they had been had, so they refused to answer. And that leads Jesus to give the parable about the two sons, which referred to them as well as publicans and harlots who would come and hear him gladly. And then he gives the parable of the wicked husbandman. And that ends chapter 21. All right, comment or question? Anybody? Okay, let's move right on. On Sunday morning in our study, we actually ended, we were reading through the note on, I can find it in my own notes here. Let's see. We are in this third stage. On page 112, up toward the top, we had read the notes that dealt with Jesus being scourged and mocked by these fellows, by these soldiers. And we had read note number 3 at the top of 112, and also note number 4, that how Jesus must have looked is how God wants us to view how he views sin. And so that's where we are. All right, here we go. Want to remember the events surrounding all this, the trials of Jesus. The two main groupings, first the Jewish and the Roman. Jewish, Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, and then he's condemned to die by the Sanhedrin. Then they take him to Pilate, who did not want to have all this on himself, and so he sent Jesus to Herod. Herod wanted to see what? A miracle. Jesus did not answer any of that. And then back to Pilate, and we have basically 3 times Pilate says, I find no fault in it. And so that's where we are. We looked at the family tree of Herod Sunday, and we're not spending any time on that. Then the third stage, is where we are now. And then the scourging of Jesus. We showed the Pilate stone, and then the scourging. I've got this out of order. Jesus is scourged and mocked by the Roman soldiers. Let's move on here. On number B, on page 112, likely Pilate thought that by scourging Jesus, he could please the rulers among the Jews, and by delivering him up as a released prisoner, he could please the multitudes, and at the same time escape from an awkward situation. The fact was that Pilate pleased no one. Why was Pilate's decision to have Jesus scourged illegal? Anybody?
He wasn't guilty of anything.
Exactly. He was an innocent man. Why do something that oftentimes resulted in death to someone who was innocent? And he admitted that. But he's trying to pacify these Jewish leaders. Politicians never do that anymore, do they? Kind of pacify their constituents? No. By the way, I've mentioned this before. My dad had the book when it first came out, and he encouraged me to read it. Though I don't think John F. Kennedy wrote it, though his name's on the book, as a ghostwriter likely. But Profiles in Courage. Do any of you have that book? Do you even know? Do you know it's in existence? Some of you do. I've had this was my dad's copy, but Kennedy, or whoever the ghostwriter was, looked at a number of senators in United States history who basically were willing to give up politics, give up their career, give up everything because of principle, holding to principles of right. And it's really a great book. And it's been a while since I went back through it, and I need to do that. But Pilate was not like that. He's trying to satisfy the Jews, does not want to be in hot water with Caesar. And so, what do you do? What do? You can't have it. When you try to please, turn over real quickly to Galatians 1. Whoever has 10 and 11, I believe it is. Galatians 1, 10 and 11. 9 and 10, I'm sorry. 9 and 10.
As we have said before, I say now again, if any man is preaching you a gospel contrary to that you receive, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ.
Yes, thank you. That verse 10 is so significant. Am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? Well, if that was his motive, he would not be a servant of whom? Of Christ. And so we've got to make up our mind. Whom will we serve? Our jobs? Our spouse, our family, or is it God? And we try to the best of our ability. Paul did say, as much as in you lies, be at what? Be at peace with all men, Romans 12. And there's no use in just being, a knot on a log to be a knot on a log. We try to be agreeable as far as we can possibly be. But ultimately, we have to serve God. God's will, God's way, God's kingdom, God's law. That's first. And we're going to do that regardless. And if some people like it, wonderful. If some people do not like it, I'm just sorry. I'm sorry you feel that way. But we don't placate unrighteous people in order to pacify them at the expense of pleasing God. And so that's one reason Christians really could never be politicians. You could never be a politician. You're seeking somebody else, and it just won't work. All right. After Jesus was scourged, he was taken inside the what? The Praetorium. That's right. Which was the governor's residence, known as the Fortress of Antonia. We showed pictures of that, situated in the northwest corner of the temple area. It was here Jesus was subjected to intense mockery, and where Paul would later make a speech. We talked about that. Remember, Jesus was similarly mocked and beaten by the Jews during the second stage of the Jewish trial. In order, Jesus was beaten and mocked during his Jewish trial, taken to Pilate, then Herod, back to Pilate where the Romans scourged him, then mocked and humiliated him a second time. Roman soldiers did the following, and I tried to put this in a 1, 2, 3 order. Disrobed him of his own clothes, Matthew 27, robed him with a purple and scarlet robe, obviously out of in taunting and derision, crowned him with a crown of thorns, sceptered him with a reed, put a reed in his hand, adored him by kneeling before him, spat on him in derision, and then hit him on his head with a reed. All of those passages are parallel there. Question, what might the disrobing and robing, why might that be so painful? Well, he had already undergone what?
Scourging.
The scourging. And so your back is just ripped to shreds. And then you have this robe put on you and it's on you for a while. What happens when you're bleeding and then something is on you for a few minutes or maybe it sticks. It sticks. And then what happens when it's pulled off? Yeah, it's just exactly tremendous pain that he undergoes through this humiliation. And I mentioned in the note, as the Jews in mockery and humiliation treated him as a prophet, the Romans in mockery and humiliation treated him as a king. There's so much irony, my friends, in all of this. They treat him as a prophet, which is what he was, and the Romans treat him as a king, which is what he was, but not the kind that they supposed. There's just so many ideas that kind of bleed together, pardon the pun, with what Jesus is undergoing that just pull together so much of the Bible story. All right. Comment, question, anybody?
Nor were they when they were treating him as the prophet and king, it was not out of respect and honor.
Oh,
It was
no.
completely opposite.
Exactly. It was out of derision and mockery, taunting. Yeah. And I think that's really what we have back in John's account when, Jesus says, behold, your king. This is your king, and he's all beat to a pulp. That's before he's crucified. And wearing a crown of thorns. This is, behold, your king. And perhaps he said it in taunting, maybe thinking that there would be some pity on their part, and he still wouldn't have to sentence him to die. All throughout, Pilate knew he was innocent, all the way to the end. And we have this, if we get to it tonight, to the very end when he took water and did what? Washed his hands, which had a Jewish background to it, but he used it hypocritically to indicate he just didn't know what to do. I'm getting rid of my part in it. I don't know who's guilty, who's innocent, when really he did. And so the whole thing on the part of Pilate was a sham. It was a sham.
And all these things, Philip, like you just went through in this list of these different passages, I mean, all of them just conjure up just such a terrible, picture when you're seeing that in your mind and framing all those things they did to Jesus. And then on the other hand, as I was reading it and rereading it and studying it, I just kept on thinking, and this is a picture of marvelous love. And those two just don't go together. I mean, it doesn't look like they go together.
Oh, yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. One of our favorite songs, Isaac Watts, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour out contempt on all my pride. If I have any pride, what number is that? Is it 168? No, that doesn't sound right. It's on the right-hand page. Does anybody know? I wanted to
223 maybe. No.
When I survey that doesn't sound right, though, Gene.
Maybe.
What is it? 140? Did you look it up?
189.
189. That sounds right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. In verse, in the third stanza, is what I was thinking about, Patty. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did ere such love and sorrow meet? Just exactly what you said. You have both the love of God, the love of Christ, and the terribleness of sin all meeting together at the cross. Or thorns compose so rich a crown. That third stanza, when I was with a group one time, we sang that and we paused as if we had a fermata after the word see. You notice there's a comma. See. From his head, his hands, his feet. It's calling attention. You're visualizing exactly what you're talking about. Sorrow and love flow mingled down. I think it's very effective to do it that way. But that song is so good. It's so moving on exactly what you're talking about. All of those elements are mixed together at the cross of Christ. I was thinking about trying to preach on it at some point. It's almost mind-boggling to me because there are so many things involved. It's almost like, where do you start? Where do you stop? You know what I mean, Brother Gene? It's just so many things that go together. And even when Jesus is on the cross, so many of the statements made against him in derision were ironic statements. Save yourself if you're able, you know. Well, the very fact that he stayed there provided their salvation. And just, so much of that. Okay, we got several minutes here. Pilate reluctantly sentences Jesus to be crucified in these passages down at the bottom of 112. Let's read these. Matthew 27, 22 through 26, Mark 15, 12 through 15, Luke 23, and John 19. We'll spend just a minute doing that. Kay, if you don't mind, if you would read Matthew 27, 22 through 26. Paula, Mark 15, 12 through 15. Sandra, Luke 23, 20 through 25. Brother Randy, John 19, 4 through 16. Okay, Matthew 27, 22 through 26.
Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. And when he had scourged him, Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified.
All right, real quick on verse 25. The people tell Pilate, "His blood be upon us and our children." It's just another wonderful term. When Peter said in Acts 2:39, "For to you is the promise, and to your children, and to as many as the Lord our God shall call to us." They were willing to put the guilt of the murdering the Son of God even on their children. And yet what they did accomplished the fact that salvation could come to them as well as for their children. All right, Mark's account here. Mark 15, 12 through 15.
Pilate answered and said to them again, What then do you want me to do with him whom you call the King of the Jews? They cried out again, "Crucify him." Then Pilate said to them, Why, what evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, he released released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified.
Yes, verse 15 that you just read, Pilate wishing to content or satisfy the multitude. Pilate's motives his personal motives come into play in all this, and really the people, the Jewish leaders, will appeal to Pilate's personal gain, personal motive, and that because the legalities won't work for them. All right, Luke's account, Luke 23, 25.
Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, Why, what evil hath he done? I have found no fault of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they had required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will.
Yes, and we pointed out Sunday morning in John 18:40, there's one other charge that was laid against Barabbas. Not only was he guilty of being an insurrectionist or sedition, and here murder, but he was also a robber. Okay, now the passage that Randy is going to read in John 19 is actually the more exhaustive of all the accounts in this part of the phase of the trial with Pilate. 19, 4 through 16. Now, he's already scourged. Notice in 19:1, he's already had Jesus scourged. A crown of thorns is on him. And hail, hail, King of the Jews. And now Pilate goes out to the people. I want to call your attention to one other thing here. In verse 4 down through, I marked it, 4 through 8, Pilate is with the Jews. Then in 9 through 12, he's back with Jesus. And then in 13 through 16, he brings Jesus out to the people. So you have with the Jews arguing with them, then he's private with Jesus, and then he brings Jesus out before the people. Okay? 4 through 16, Randy.
And Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus therefore came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When therefore the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Pilate therefore heard the statement. He was the more afraid, and he entered into the tomb again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me up to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar.
All right, so let me interrupt you just for a second, Randy. That was the final nail in the lid of the coffin there. Thou art not Caesar's friend. You make yourself a king, you speak against Caesar. Well, they'd already charged him. He says he's the king of the Jews. And so look at the reaction and how this leads eventually to him reluctantly sentencing Jesus. Okay, Randy, 13 on.
So when Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, the Bottom. Now it was the day for preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. They cried out, Away with him, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. And so he then delivered him up to them to be crucified.
All right, thank you, Randy. Behold your king. And they show their complete rejection by saying, we have no king but Caesar. Some of the parables that Jesus had given indicated this very thing, that they would reject God's Son. You know, Matthew 21, Matthew 22, the parable of the wedding feast. And as a result of he would send prophets and messengers and so on, and they would treat them despitefully. Well, maybe they'll do better with my son. They sent the son and then they kill him. So then in the parables, Jesus says, well, what's going to happen? Well, the king will send his army and destroy their city. So as a result of their national, and that doesn't mean everybody did this to Jesus, but as the leadership of the Jews did, then what that means is as a nation they rejected him. So as a nation they were going to be brought to their knees by the Romans. And that would be just a few years later. Okay, I wanted to go to show a slide I put together today. Pilate's, by the way, this account in John, I mentioned a while ago, is most exhaustive. We have the interplay between Pilate, the people, Pilate, and Jesus, more so than we do in the other accounts, right, at least at this point. Pilate's changing psychological attitudes are fascinating, and yet they're sad. The record paints a picture of Pilate's ego and his motivations. It begins by being curious, that's back in the 18th chapter, then a desire to be fair. What evil has he done? Then fear. Remember, they said, we have a law, and he's violated. He makes himself God's son. And that's when he has the personal interview again, to respect and fairness, then back to fear and a desire to save his. Anybody who makes himself a king is not Caesar's friend. And so he goes back to fear and a desire to save his career and his reputation regardless of the price. In the end, he does the wrong things for the wrong reasons. This phase of Jesus' trial before Pilate could be summarized as follows. The Jews first brought a general accusation against Jesus. Remember, in the Jewish phases, they said he's worthy of death because he admits that he is the what? The Son of God. Art thou then the Son of God? Thou sayest, it is as you say. Well, they changed the charge and at first just say, well, he's an evildoer. He needs to be put to death. And Pilate said, well, what has he done? And so he's determined to hear more. And that's when he said, well, are you a king? He presses the title King of the Jews. The Jews do, as seditious. But Pilate, in his interview with Jesus, 1836 and 37, 38, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then would my servants fight. Pilate just is kind of on his heels. Well, I don't see any wrong in this. It's a different kind of a kingdom. And so Pilate dismisses that due to his private examination of Jesus. Then in this 19th chapter, they bring a religious offense against their own law. We have a law, and by this he ought to die because he makes himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard that, what did he create in him? Fear. Yeah, he's fearful. And so then he has that private exchange with Jesus. Where did you come from? And Jesus doesn't answer that. Can you imagine telling him where he came from in 5 to 10 seconds? And said, don't you know that I have power to release you and power? And then Jesus just says, there's no power given to you, but from heaven. It reminds us of Romans 13. But he that has delivered me to you has greater sin. And so they bring this religious offense. Last, they appealed to Pilate's own fears that if he did not acquiesce to their demands, he was not Caesar's friend. Thus, through Pilate's personal motives, the Jews are able to accomplish their purpose when all legal measures had failed. Nothing legal about it at all. And they get Jesus on this idea that really Pilate's egotism and his desire to satisfy the whims of these Jewish leaders. Okay, let's answer just a few questions. We have a couple of minutes left. A, under number 10, bottom of 112, John's account describes what occurred following the scourging. After the scourging was administered, Pilate brought Jesus out to the Jews. He wanted them to know that he had found no crime in him. How was Jesus still dressed?
Wearing a
Crown of thorns and what kind of a garment?
Purple.
A purple garment, yeah. Mockery of royalty. At this point, Pilate must have felt he had sufficiently humiliated Jesus, the Jews' king, to the point that every suspicion of royalty was removed. What does Pilate call Jesus?
The man.
The man. Behold the man. I drew an arrow in my Bible. You can't see it. It wouldn't matter even if you could. But from verse 5, the last phrase, behold the man. And then when he last brings him out in verse 14, last part of the phrase, behold your king. Behold the man. Behold your king. Jesus was both, wasn't he? He was all human, bodily, and yet in Colossians 2 verse 9, in him, the body, dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And so he's behold the man. He's the exemplar, the example. He the great example, and a pattern should be that we sometimes sing. He is the man, and yet he at the same time is our king, deity. Okay. Let's see, C down at the bottom. How did the chief priests and officers respond? Yes. Crucify him. On the next page, this frustrates Pilate because his plan was rejected. The Jews never wavered in their demand for Jesus' execution. How does Pilate answer them? Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no fault. Well, Pilate knew they couldn't do that, but evidently taunting, as I mentioned in the note, Pilate knows very well that without his order, the Jews cannot crucify Jesus. Therefore, in a veiled way, he's reminding the Jews of their political impotence. His words were not a permission to crucify, but a bit of taunting irony, as if to say, I, the judge, have found him innocent, but ye seem to lack the wit to see that the case is ended. If you're so much superior to the judge that you can ignore his decision, proceed without him. Crucify him yourselves. How then do they respond to Pilate?
And they have a law that he should die because he claimed to be the Son of God.
Exactly right, Kay. And I mentioned in the note, the Jews revert to their original accusation against Jesus. While they had not mentioned this earlier due to the fact Pilate would not have enforced such a law, they do now to justify their actions. Let's do one more. What reaction did this cause in Pilate? John 19:8. He became what? The more afraid, terrified, because he had heard about, some of the gods, the idolatrous gods, and some of their descendants might be on earth at this place. Maybe there's some, I think Pilate because maybe there's some truth to this. I need to, investigate a little more. And that's what he does. All right, let's stop there. And Lord willing, pick up Sunday there F or G rather, on page 113. Comment or question before we ring the bell? David, you look like you wanted to say something.
I was just thinking what was in Pilate's mind after Christ had died and the earth had gone dark and the quake, what he was saying.
What in the world have I done? Yeah, yeah.